As I assume all of you know, AB 109 is principally designed to divert people who are charged what they call them the non-nons, non-violent, non-serious, non-sex offenders, to the counties to be held there and to serve time in county jails. There's other aspects which are parole violations, technical violators. They cannot serve nearly as much time as they used to. That was a big part of the problem, were the technical parole violators. California for a long time has had a very aggressive policy of locking up people in the state prison system for technical violations. There's a whole history there about how that came about. And the other interesting thing that people have not paid much attention to is that if you do your sentence locally under the AB 109, you no longer have any parole supervision requirement. You do your sentence and you're done, unless you get what's called a split sentence, which means you serve some portion of your time in the jail, and then you serve the rest under some form of supervision, usually provided by the probation department. But we are going to see, and I'll just kind of jump into the major findings we're already seeing, we're going to see a huge drop in the parole population. Prior to AB 109, there were approximately 90,000 people under parole supervision in the state of California. It's projected, and that projection is looking pretty good, it's going to get down to like 20, 25,000. So an interesting experiment going on, which is what happens to people now who, instead of doing a prison term and then being sentenced to parole for 1, 2, or 3 years, have nothing. They just get released to the community. And so that'll be an interesting development. The other part, though, is what's happening to the state prison population and then what's happening at the county jail level. So this first chart is basically, if you look at the blue line, blue-red line, this is prison population. And when we talk about prison, the vocabulary gets kind of strange, but we're talking about prisoners in the state facilities or that are contracted out to 3 states that hold inmates. So there's about 8,500 state inmates, California state inmates, that are being held in 3 states by private providers. The long-term plan is to bring those 8,000 plus inmates back into state facilities. Then there's a group, they're state sentence inmates, but they're being housed at the county jail level. In my mind, they're still state inmates, such as instead of realignment, I like to call it relocation. We've simply moved them from state facilities to county jails. I'll talk about some positive stuff that's happening out of that. But this is the trend line of how much that state institutional population is going to drop, and actually has dropped. It's dropped fairly significantly. We started out as high as 175,000 when AB 109 got passed, and it was implemented in October 1st, 2011. It was about 160-some thousand. You can, I don't know if you can see it, but we're now down to in 2012. We're now down to, in the state facilities, we have about 119,000. There's another 8,500 in the private prisons, so somewhere between 127, 130,000 are now state inmates still at the state institutions, or they are in these private prisons. The court case requires them to get down to about 110,000. And you can see that's flattening out. And if you haven't heard, the state has conceded that they are not going to hit the mark. And the mark is 137.5% of rated capacity. So the plan was for California to stay crowded. And this line does not go down any further. In fact, it starts going up a little bit. And I'll explain why that is. So we're kind of stuck in California at the state level with this still very large state prison population. We've gotten rid of a good chunk of people, but not enough to really solve the crowding problem in the state facilities. This is kind of looking at the trend in terms of the jail population. So the red line is where we are headed. Now, before AB 109 happened, and this is fairly typical across the country, the jail populations were declining. They were declining. I should mention here that the crime rates have dropped dramatically in the country. They've dropped dramatically in California. The crime rate today in California, which is serious crimes reported to police, today is what it was in 1965. In 1965, we had about 19 or 20,000 inmates in our state prison population. If you're to actually take the crime rate that we have today and apply it to the California population, which has grown obviously, and say, well, our incarceration rate back there was about 100 per 100,000. If you applied that incarceration rate that we had when crime rates were so low, we would have a state prison population of about 55,000. So again, we're stuck at about 130,000 or so, and it looks like that's not going to move too much. This green line is the jail population that's now going to go up into the county jails. This is the projection of where that jail population is going to go if we just simply reallocate them at the local level. In California, at the time AB 109 was passed, we had 18,000 empty jail beds. Los Angeles had about 7,000 empty jail beds. So we had solved the jail problem pretty much. And then along comes AB 109. And because I do a lot of work nationally, what you really see is that California is now becoming like Louisiana and Kentucky. Those are two states that have placed large percentages of their state inmates in. In Louisiana, it's in the parish prisons, and in Kentucky, it's in their detention facilities, which are primarily run by private providers. So today, is this any good? Have we just kind of kicked the can down the road a little bit, or are we doing anything, that's really innovative except just pushing the problem down to the local level? And I don't think that question's been answered. I know in some counties we haven't done anything. In other counties, like San Francisco, Santa Cruz, which I'm familiar with, they are taking advantage of portions of the law where they can actually sentence people differently. They can do what's called a blended sentence or a split sentence. So they don't have to give them the full term that the court is required by law. They can break it up. So in a place like San Francisco, about 40% of their sentences locally are split sentences. Consequently, their jail population is not growing. Los Angeles is not doing that at all. So their jail population has grown from 14,800 to over 19,200, and it's going to peak at about 21,000, 22,000 if nothing happens. So you can see a lot of variation going on among the counties. This kind of shows what got carved out of AB 109, the blue and the red. That's the tumors that got removed from the patient. But you can see that big green area, that's 81%. So they're going to stay. They're going to stay in a crowded state prison system. More significantly, if you look what's really left in the state facility are what most people would consider politically tough cases to get reform issues on. 26% are second strikers, 7% are third strikers, 19% are lifers with parole eligibility, 3% are lifers with no parole eligibility, 28% are violent offenders, which means they have to do 80% of their prison terms, and only 16% are in this non-violent category, and these are people that without any further approval by the voters, you could do something with. So I want to emphasize that that population that's left in the state prison system from a political offense perspective is a tough one to look at, because you'd have to be recommending that they get shorter sentences, shorter lengths of stay. Now, the good news from a criminologist perspective is that extremely large percentages of these people are low risk. They're low risk because of their attributes. The Department of Corrections does all this risk assessment. They have a couple of tools that they're using. But because of their age, the amount of time that they've served, even the offenses they've committed, which we know are associated with lower recidivism rates, there is a big chunk in here that is safe to release. There's no question about that. And we could release tens of thousands of them and not have any impact on the crime rate or jeopardize public safety. But politically, you're going to see a lot of pushing and shoving on that particular issue. I want to talk about the ICE inmates. There are what we call Iceholes in state prisons. And as Ruthie kind of mentioned, these are people who, unlike the people, the 36,000, I think you said, 34,000 that are in the ICE detention category, these are people that have been sentenced to prison for criminal offenses, but have deportation holds on them. So upon completion of their sentence, they're transferred over to ICE for deportation. Approximately 56,000 in the country fall into that category. California leads it, as I mentioned, about 18,500, followed by Texas, New York, and Arizona. I want to show this. This is the state California Iceholes pre-AB 109. So a lot of these people now have been scattered into the county jails because of AB 109. Some are still in the state prison. But 83% of them are moderate to low risk. And this is going to be something we're going to talk about right after I stop talking here, is risk. If you look at these people, and if you look at the detained immigrants, from a criminological point of view, they overwhelmingly are lower risk. They have come to this country not to commit crimes, but to get a job, try and get citizenship, trying to get legal status. So they are very well-behaved people with respect to their criminal conduct. And this is going to raise some important issues when we start talking about reforming the number of people that are in detention who are ICE related. The other thing that's related, which is in the county jails, we have large numbers of these people that are in the county jails who have ICE holds on them. Often that is restricting their ability to get out on pretrial status. They, from a criminologist point of view, they are very good risks to be released in that they will not commit crimes if released. But obviously the issue of showing up for a deportation hearing, which means you're likely to be deported, that's a different issue. And I think that's why so many of these people are being detained, is that the government thinks that they are not good risk for showing up for deportation hearings. All right, so that's kind of an overview of AB 109. Big picture. Again, we've lowered that population. It's not been lowered enough to meet the court order. Still a crowded system. We're seeing disturbances still in the California prison system. We now have these people in local jails. Is this a better place for them? Are the conditions better or worse? Can the local counties handle this? There are lots of opportunities for counties to do things differently, which will help ease whatever increase in the jail population, which is going to be my segue now into this panel. We're going to talk about pretrial release. All right, so most of the inmates in the county jails in California and nationally are in pretrial status. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 60-75% nationally are pretrial. That's the basic statistic of any jail system in the United States and certainly in California. Most of the people that come to jail are coming in for a misdemeanor crime. But they generally get released quickly either through an OR citation or bail. What's left are people charged with the more serious crimes, felonies, where the bail is higher and it's more difficult to get out. So if you look at a snapshot of a jail population, in California, you're going to see it is predominantly pretrial, and within that pretrial, predominantly a felon population. So the panel today, I'm asking them to deal with two basic topics, which is, as part of AB 109, they were given money and resources to expand the use of pretrial in California. The logic being is that if they could do that, then there'd be more room for the AB 109 inmates that would be jumping up the prison population, or the local jail population. So I'm interested in hearing from our panelists, what they see is going on in pretrial in California, where are the good practices, what are the challenges, and how is AB 109 having any kind of impact on that? And then finally, the issue of the pretrial inmates that are being held as, they have a warrant for them from ICE. So how is that blocking their ability to get out? And when they do have their charges taken care of at the local level, what's happening to them? So our panelists, we have three excellent speakers. The first one is David Muhammad. He's the former Chief Probation Officer of Alameda County Probation. David is very well known throughout the state of California as a progressive, assertive person in charge of probation services, and more precisely pretrial services. I'm going to have him go first, and then Anna Campbell, who's the National Network Coordinator, Access to Justice, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. I think she'll have a lot to do, with what kind of services are out there for people who are released, and the extent to which you can kind of help guarantee that they will show up for their deportation hearings. And then last but not least is Garry Herceg, who's the current director, or not the current, but the director of the Office of Pretrial Services in Santa Clara County, one of the big county jail systems in California. Prior to Santa Clara, he worked in Santa Cruz County, where he worked in the pretrial service area there as well. Each of you have about 10 minutes. If you go over 10 minutes, I'll shut you down. We go one after another, and then as soon as Garry is finished, then we'll open up for questions from the audience.
In New York and then Alameda County, the three places where I've been involved in the juvenile and criminal justice system. And let me just start off with the premise. I was an executive director of a nonprofit, the Mentoring Center in Oakland, and then we started doing direct services for young people in the California Youth Authority, and then started doing policy advocacy. And an old time colleague, Dr. Austin here, Giraldi, asked me to come to Washington, D.C. To be involved in the juvenile justice system. I would never imagine that I would actually be in running the system, but spend so much time railing against the system, and only decided to do that there, and then in New York, and then back home in Alameda County for the specific reason of making significant change. And so I say that to say before I make a couple of early statements of the principle that we try to use everywhere where we were working on reform is that incarceration is very traumatic and it's very harmful, just as in general. And it's also extraordinarily expensive. Therefore, we should only use incarceration for individuals who are a genuine risk to the public safety. And generally, even in folks who may not be progressive-minded or reform-minded, they can understand that incarceration is supposed to be for those who are a risk to the public safety. But then making that determination of who is a risk versus someone else is where we get into some very unfortunately political discussions, when it really should be more around science and research and what we know works and doesn't work. But to that end, a lot of young people, I'm going to talk about some of the things we did on the juvenile side in Washington, D.C. A lot of young people and a lot of adults are locked up when really no one considers them an actual risk to public safety. Because of bureaucratic expediency, or because of other reasons, because of some of these far out over years, get tough on crime laws. We have a lot of people incarcerated who don't meet the threshold of a genuine risk of public safety. So within that, we have a lot of room to make changes. As has been presented to us in California, there has been dramatic change in the inmate population in California. So when I was in Washington, D.C., we were under a lawsuit and entered into a consent decree. And a big part of the lawsuit, while it was treatment of young people in our juvenile facilities, most of that mistreatment was because of the extreme overpopulation. And so we started a number of reform efforts to reduce our detention population. So we had alternative to detention and detention and diversion. All of these for young people pre-trial. They're going through their adjudication process. These are young people who have not been, quote unquote, convicted, so we'll use that language in juvenile court, convicted of any crime. And so we started, what I liked the least, just because of how it was developed, but shelter programs, but that were effective. So young people who would be locked up in the detention center were allowed to go to basically a group home, privately run by community-based organizations while they're going through their adjudication process. So they're not at home, but they're living in what, for the most part, amounts to a group home, or what's called a shelter home, run by a community-based organization for the approximately 35 days that it took for them to go through their adjudication process, where they would be taken to school by the shelter home and they would be taken to court by the shelter home provider. The other one that we started, which I thought was much better, is called evening reporting centers. And so again, young people who would have otherwise been locked up while going through their adjudication process were allowed to go home. But every day after school, they were picked up by the recreation center, the community center, again, a community-based organization, privately run, a nonprofit, would pick them up from school, take them to their center where they would finish homework, engage in any other enrichment activities they had, the computer lab, the recreation activities, and then they were driven home for their court-mandated curfew. These alternatives, the Evening Reporting Center in particular, over the course of 5 years, the agency that we were part of, called the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, did a study over 5 years of our use of Evening Reporting Centers, and it had a 97% success rate. So 97% of the hundreds of young people who were court-ordered to Evening Reporting Center did the two things that you want a detention diversion program to do. A, the young person did not reoffend during the time of their adjudication process, and B, they showed up to all their court dates. That's the two things you want to happen in a detention diversion, detention alternative program. 97% successful Evening Reporting Centers, and the shelter programs were similar high success rate, but because it was out of home, the only time we actually had wasn't successful young people running from them. They always ran home. And so these have a lot of application to this discussion of what to do with people instead of just warehousing them for fear that they won't make their court dates. In New York, which there was a huge issue at Rikers Island with Iceholes, and as we tried to do some justice reinvestment, when we're trying to reduce the use of incarceration, capture those savings, and spend that money on community development programs or programs that would serve youth and adults in the community that they live. We had a huge issue because at one point, Rikers Island had something like 25% Iceholes, which I thought was a huge number of people on Rikers Island who otherwise would actually be released, but because they were being held on pending ICE detention hearings. So to go to Alameda County, one of the things that we were working with the sheriff department on, because the sheriff's department in Alameda County doesn't have a real risk assessment around detention and has an assessment by which they classify you for where you will be housed in the Alameda County jail. They're not a real risk assessment, and by the time I got back to Alameda County, had stopped its pretrial release program. Partially because there was 1,000 beds, as Dr. Austin said, in California we had semi-solved the jail problem prior to AB 109. And so we had 1,000 empty beds, and so there really wasn't a lot going on the adult side around pretrial diversion. On the juvenile side, we implemented Evening Reporting Centers. We partnered with one of the biggest and best youth services and agencies and centers in the city of Oakland, and opened up an Evening Reporting Center. And let me just say a caution of, particularly for juveniles, but this is true of adults as well, a caution of some of the great pretrial diversion is the issue of net widening. And that is a big issue that we struggle with in Alameda County, because the Evening Reporting Center that we opened as an alternative to detention was in this wonderful youth center, Youth Uprising in East Oakland, with all of these incredible programs. is where judges just send you there because they really like the sentence. Right? And that's what happens across the country with really good programs, is we really like that, so we're going to send as many young people as possible. Well, the problem is that young person would have gone home anyway. So don't court order a young person, or adult for that matter, to something when the alternative would have been just go home, right? Because another premise is criminal justice involvement in your life almost always makes you worse. Let me just say that again. Many studies have borne this out, particularly for lower risk folks. Criminal justice involvement in your life generally makes you worse, right? And so in terms of trying to make a better person, and this sometimes, right, goes against reason, criminal justice is supposed to be the safety net that supposedly rehabilitates people. That just hasn't been what has happened historically in this country, right? And so understanding that you don't want to get involved, particularly with lower risk individuals, adults, or juveniles, you want to have less involvement as possible. So a big risk for a lot of these pretrial or detention or diversion programs is netlining. So Alameda County did the evening report and said, on the adult side, when AB 109 came down, it was a big argument because there was a discussion of you don't need pretrial diversion because the jail has enough space. But again, and ironically, even though Alameda County has 1,000 beds, one of the highest percentage of counties in the state with pretrial population. About 77% of Alameda County's jail population is pretrial. Again, people who have not been convicted. And again, if this is America, and there is this notion supposedly in America that you are innocent until proven guilty, right? And then you're supposed to have this pretrial population who is supposed to have this presumption of innocence. And so if you go into it with that, then you can take things that have been researched, like risk assessments, which I have my significant challenge with many risk assessments, but there are risk assessments that say this person is more or less likely to show up to his or her court date if released. And many of those risk assessments have been proven effective. And so if we can say, based upon the number of times that you have been convicted before of a crime, and the seriousness of that crime, and the age when you first got involved in the criminal justice system, and how old you are now, that gives us, are you a threat to the public safety or not? The second question is, will you show up to your court date? And the only time you really should be detained for that reason is if you have some behavior that has exhibited a reason for you to be considered at high risk, meaning you had a court date you didn't show up to before, right? Your status shouldn't determine, your status as a human being, as an individual, shouldn't determine your risk. It should be in past behavior that determines future behavior, which is the basis of the risk assessment. So last thing I just want to say is the big issue around reducing prison populations has been the risk of increased crime. As was stated earlier, California has reduced over the last 9 months, and even more so over the last 2 years, but in the last 9 months, a nearly 30,000 person reduction in the inmate population without any significant crime rise whatsoever. Small pockets of crime going slightly up throughout the state, none of which could be blamed on realignment. And so you've been able to have a huge prison population reduction without any increase in crime, and somewhat the untold story, I believe, and I was in New York prisons are at 50% capacity, right? So California's huge reduction hasn't gotten them down to 137% capacity, right? Which is the court mandated capacity. New York is at 50% capacity. When New York's crime has also gone down, humongous reduction in crime. One of the few states, I think there's only three states that have had dramatic decrease in prison population and dramatic decrease in crime, busting up the myth that the way you solve crime is through incarceration. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned around how to safely and effectively reduce the prison population, have alternatives that are effective to make sure people don't reoffend, and that they are successful examples of this, not just throughout the state of California, but throughout the country.
Hello all, I'm Campbell with Immigration and Refugee Service. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the program that I'm going to talk about a little bit right now, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the criminal justice world that apply to those detained by ICE, which is what I'm going to talk about. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service is probably So the pilot program that I'm going to talk about kind of takes all of these services and skills learned throughout the years of our service to arriving refugees and children and applies them, like I said, to folks detained by ICE who we think don't need to be there and to be served better in the community at a much cheaper cost to the government, as well as in line with both domestic enforcement and international humanitarian obligations. So the pilot, what it is to start this year. Therefore, we don't have a ton of data and information about what exactly is going to come of it. That's kind of, I think, where we have a lot of lessons to be learned from the criminal justice system to see what does success mean, what does it look like. But this pilot, what it does is combine legal services for those who are in detention, getting them out of detention, and combines that with a case management approach to ensuring that they are not only complying with what is mandated by ICE as part of their ongoing proceedings, but also have an access to social services in the community while they await a final order, whether it's removal or if they're granted to stay in the United States. So we have 6 different communities primarily that we're working in, where we have kind of combined the holistic model, like I said, of the social service agencies with the expertise and knowledge of serving populations from overseas, from the United States, in need of integration services, as well as our legal expertise working with different legal service providers throughout the country who are going into detention facilities, screening and identifying people who are eligible to get out, who may not have community ties to get out, but need that, having the social service agency kind of act as that sponsor for their release, and then providing them with the complement services that we think will encourage compliance, but also help for their long-term integration in the United States. Keys to this, as I mentioned, and what David was talking about, is an assessment tool not only used by the government to determine whether or not someone needs to be in detention, but then also by the service providers when someone is going to be released or out, to determine what their true needs beyond just legal services, which are obvious for someone who's in ongoing immigration proceedings. But what are their needs beyond legal that person needs to try and really support their compliance with ongoing proceedings, whether that's housing, access to mental and medical health care, education services, transportation services, the whole gamut of what a human needs living outside of an attorney. So our hope is that we're going to pilot this for 3 years, hope to serve at a minimum of 300 people, which is really nothing. We're hoping that we get that many people. We know that that's a really small population, at least compared to what's detained right now, or who has detainers on them who will be transferred. But it's a start, and we're hoping that we can track enough information to show that it is more cost effective, that it is better for their long-term integration, and that it can still meet enforcement needs on ICE's side. A couple of things that we're obviously very well aware of and that are difficult is in this first just 6 months of the pilot, in a couple of our locations actually, people who are released out of detention and transferred to the non-detained pocket of people in court proceedings, some folks are not yet scaled up to hearing until 2015. So unlike the 35-day average for a child that he was talking about released in one of these reporting alternatives, our folks are going to be in removal proceedings for years. And so the cost, not only the cost affiliated with that, which can be huge, but also just the things that come with waiting that long for the future of your life is going to be difficult as far as the but we believe the programs that we're working with and the communities that we're in right now are feasible, like I said, of being still at a much cheaper cost than it would be for them to be in detention even if it's just for a month. I know there's going to be a lot of questions. Something to mention is that we are interested in justice trafficking. I'm sure some of you all know this, but 1997 to 2000 piloted a program kind of like this, kind of different. But 97 to 2000, and they have a report just about that, which did show that folks who have incentive to show up for their ongoing immigration proceedings are likely to do so. And therefore, general conclusion, but therefore the government should be releasing them into the community as long, to be getting all these extra services as well as complying with their ongoing immigration proceedings. Currently, the U.S. government, ICE gets $2.5 billion for its detention operations. Less than 4% of that is used on their alternative detention program, which currently is isn't what we would consider a real community-based approach. It's a private company, the Behavioral Interventions, which is now owned by CEO, the private prison corporation, to monitor someone's compliance, and really just solely their compliance with the PD showing up for court within their compliance with leaving the country if they're ordered to do so. So it is a form of alternative, yes, but it's not really what we consider a real community-based approach to support somebody's long-term integration, and really taking into consideration that folks released are not going to just be ordered removed, but living in the community long-term. And we should be supporting all the aspects of that individual while they're going through the process of seeking diffusion and space. I know there's going to be a ton of questions, and I'm here to do that, but I want to pass the microphone on.
So, good morning, everyone. I was getting on the plane last night and to fly down here, and was going to think about what I was going to say today, and David covered most of it, so bear with me. But a woman sat down next to me, and she was reading a book that I had previously read, and I commented on it, and we struck up a conversation. The woman's name is Lydia. And whenever you meet someone new, they always ask you, what do you do for a living? And you say, well, I work for Santa Clara County Pretrial Services. Of course, most people don't know what pretrial services is, so I explained to Lydia, well, we interview defendants brought into the county jail, and we write a report on them and make a recommendation to the judge if they can be released back into the community, and if they do release them, we supervise them. Well, Lydia says to me, oh, that must be difficult to decide who gets out and who doesn't. And I say, not really, we just flip a coin. Lydia's eyes get all big. You can tell Lydia's very conservative woman. She's very concerned. And I say, Lydia, I'm just joking. And I say, actually, we analyze risk factors of individuals, and we put them in a risk assessment, and it gives us whether they would be a good candidate for release or not. And Lydia said, oh, I always just thought someone just decided, and blah, blah, blah. And I go, unfortunately, some people do that. They just, subjective human decision making, they release individuals. But that's not what we do in Santa Clara. And in fact, that, way back to 1954, in the work of Paul Meehl shows that assessments are far more accurate than human decision making in predicting future behavior. And so Lydia says to me, again, she's very witty, very quizzical, and she says, well, if risk assessments work so good, why isn't everybody doing it? And I say to Lydia, that's a very good question. I'm still looking for the answer for it. So, as you can tell, I'm kind of a risk assessment data nerd, just to be honest with everybody. I read everything, and I do a lot of studies. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our risk assessment in Santa Clara. In January 2011, we implemented the Virginia model pretrial risk assessment. It had been validated twice in the state of Virginia. To do this, we had a tremendous amount of planning. We gathered all of our stakeholders, board of supervisors, our district attorney, our judges, some community-based organizations, the public defender's office. We informed them of this decision. Judges were a little concerned about the Virginia model. They didn't have any victim information, so we added a question on that for them. And we had about 3 months before the implementation in January. And what we did, we modified our case management system to include the risk assessment in our reports that we provide to the judges, so they know where the recommendations are coming from. In addition to that, we modified our case management system to record the data on actual releases. For some reason, this wasn't being done in Santa Clara before 2011. But we wanted to know, one, is our officers following the risk assessment? And if they are they following it to the level it says? If the risk assessment says OR, are they escalating to supervised OR? And we wanted to monitor that. We also wanted to monitor the judges. Are they following our recommendation, or are they escalating people to a higher level or detaining people? And in addition to getting our case management system and these data things set up, we also conducted a series of trainings. I got all 85 judges in our county in one room and went through the risk assessment with them, question by question, showed them some data, national data, and so forth. So we trained all them. A couple weeks later, we got all the public defenders all in one room, trained all of them on the risk assessment instrument. Then we got a handful of district attorneys who involved in We also even trained one of our board of soup members on a risk assessment that was very severe. So after all these trainings, we went ahead and implemented it again in January 2011. Initial data, the first month, our releases, despite bookings going down, increased by over 100. We went from an average daily population of pretrial release of 900 to over 1,000. Through the course of 2011, we actually hit numbers in the 1,200 range. We were above 1,200 on the number of people released to us. But I gotta be transparent here. There was resistance, and resistance to risk assessments. Basically starting with my staff. Some of my staff have been there, my lead seniors, and they've been doing things a long time and they just did not want to believe that a risk assessment was a better predictor of future behavior than them. I also have 2 attorneys on my staff working as pretrial service officers. So very educated group of folks that dedicated their lives to pretrial service, and here was this new director coming in and telling them to use this risk assessment. They didn't like it very much. So in addition, there was resistance from the judges. Same thing. Years and years of experience on the bench. That risk assessment's not going to tell me to release. I know better. So, and then of course the district attorney. We actually had several meetings with them because they were questioning our recommendations in court. So we went through this, and how we combated this resistance is, one, we developed policy for our officers, performance measures that they had to follow where they could not override the risk assessment but 10% of the time. We didn't want to take full discretion away from them, but we could put that. And when they override it, they had to get approval from the supervisor. In addition, we provide this to them on a monthly basis, and the people that weren't performing to these standards, I sent all my supervisors to coaching and mentoring training, and they came back and started working with these individuals one by one. We also showed them outcome data, the people they did release and how successful they were. And we also did this, and this was, again, risky for me as a new director, is provided this information to the judges. We had some judges following the risk assessment is 94% of the time was the highest judge. She was very receptive. But we had another judge that was about 65% of the time he would follow the risk assessment. So we provided data to these individual judges and the people they did release, the outcomes, how they were successful. We did this on a monthly basis. In addition, I began reporting to the Board of Supervisors quarterly on our performance measures for pretrial services. And so I wanted to keep our information out there to build support for the risk assessment. In addition to all this, the Pretrial Justice Institute helped us greatly with the implementation of it, but also because Virginia's people are different than the people in California, I also wanted a local validated risk assessment. I didn't want to continue using the Virginia model forever. So during 2011, we had PJI study our releases, and they provide us with a validation study, and they are recommending a few modifications to enhance our risk assessment. We're in the process of doing that, and we're starting our trainings again. I got all 79 judges now in November in a room. I got all officers. PJI's giving training to our officers in 2 weeks on the validation study, and so we're moving forward. Also in 2011, we got audited. My department got audited by an independent accounting firm that contracted with the county. And while the recommendations in the audit were pretty minor, about 6 efficiency things that we can improve as far as court reports and timeliness of our court reports and stuff like that, said we saved the county $32 million in jail costs during 2011. If you take away our $5 million operating budget, we saved the county in the Senate for $27 million. With that, I just want to close with a quote from Steve Jobs. He said, "If you fail to change, you will fail to survive." And I think that's what we need to continue to do in California. Our criminal justice system will fail to survive. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gary. All right, we have about, thanks to the whole panel. We have 15 minutes for discussion. If you have a question, there's 2 mics up here, right, that are live. Come on down now. While some of you are thinking through your question. I have 3 quick questions. You have 1 minute to respond to it. And I'll start with Garry. All right, so a question is being raised now, is it appropriate to use a pretrial risk assessment instrument on people that have an Iceholes? Because there you're not predicting FTA in a typical way or pretrial crime. You're asking, are they going to show up for their deportation hearings?
Actually, in Santa Clara County, we don't honor civil detainer requests. This was passed by, thank you. I was on a civil detainer task force for the county in 2011. As you can tell, 2011 was very busy for me. But our board of supervisors in October 2011 agreed that until we started receiving funding for detainers in our jail, we would no longer honor them.
But do you think though, as a geek, you said you're a risk assessment, because this is a big question. People are talking about developing a risk instrument just for ICE cases. What's your opinion on that?
I believe that would be good as long as they have study it for a long period of time, do the research, and also the social factors of the individuals involved. That's kind of where the risk assessments are doing. And also local validation of a risk assessment. You can't just use one risk assessment all over the country. It needs to be for the local population.
Okay. Anna Campbell, why would anyone in their right mind who's released from ICE detention, knowing if they go back for the deportation hearing, they have a high probability of being deported, why would they show up?
Well, I think that high probability is questionable, I guess. People who do actually have claims to remain in the United States do show up for the hearing. So folks who are seeking asylum, torture survivors, folks with criminal histories who do have waivers and notices to stay in the United States have intended to be showing up for court hearings in order to be approved to stay there. So, I mean, that probability of being deported, yeah, there's always that possibility. But there's also a large possibility of being not approved. If they don't take the court hearing, they're absolutely ordered removed. But if they go and then go through the process of seeking information, at least with the knowledge of what's happening to them, likelihood that they could not only stay here, but then if they do actually need to go home, comply with that because they know that they have the proper care.
So does it help them if, let's say they get deported, they show up for their deportation here and they get deported, does it in any way help them if they want to reapply for admission? Can they reapply for admission to the United States?
Well, there's an appeal process. I mean, there's an appeal process for folks who are initially denied the ability to stay, and then there's an entire process that they can go through. The idea of this kind of go through that whole process, even if it's going to help for it, or access to their own attorney, access to a social worker, access to a case manager, helping them understand what it is. If I don't discuss the process, I'm sure there's one way difficult to understand for folks who work in it alone with all this happening. The idea is, and actually in that very pilot project, I think it was like, it doubled the rate of folks who comply with their final orders of removal, simply because they had information and knowledge of what was going on.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Kind of, yeah.
But the point is that folks who have incentive to show up, the potential of staying in the United States is absolutely one of these. They have every incentive to show up to those hearings.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk right now, both on the first question, which is, I personally don't think they need to develop a new risk instrument. I think that we know that they are low risk in terms of committing criminal activity. They have an interest in not doing that. And if you look at their risk factors, they tend to be in pretty good shape. They have families, they have employment, they have residency, fairly stable. So those are things that we look for in any risk instrument. But there's some talk of that. And then the other issue is, and people just say, well, why would someone show up, and if they know they're going to be deported, and you're saying they don't know they're going to be deported, and I think there's ways that you can help reassure officials that there is a high probability. If you release them to the right situation, there'll be a high probability that they will show up for their deportation hearings. Correct? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
And it was just mentioned, I mean, recently, but ICE is and has developed a
Yeah.
The question that we have all the time is how that comes for release, because we haven't yet articulated how exactly that will, they're screening for risk factors, why the movement is, but they haven't yet linked that to actually releasing folks. So how that will work for you, we see and hope, how it's coming up to those risk factors.
So David, to you, I think a question I have, which is, or maybe you can help the audience. When someone is arrested say, for a misdemeanor type of crime, generally they're booked and released pretty quickly. But if they have an ICE hold to them, what is happening to them in most county jails in California? If you could comment on what do you see as a current practice in the California pretrial release system if you do have an ICE hold lodged against you? I know in Los Angeles County Jail, they have thousands and thousands of people coming in that they're arrested for a minor crime, but they still have that ICE hold, which seems to be blocking them on getting out. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, in most places, that aren't like Santa Clara, unfortunately, they are being detained. They're being detained for people who would have otherwise not been released. And I think that, I don't think that there's a huge difference. Like there's a lot of people, I want to kind of go merge that with the first question, because there's a lot of people who get out who don't have a ICE hold, right? So citizens who are facing charges who, because of risk assessment, has said that they are likely to show up to court and unlikely to commit a new offense during their detention process. But the offense for which they're being charged with has severe penalties, sometimes up to 20 years, and they're showing up to court, right? And so that is, I would argue, more severe than deportation, the possibility of 20 years in prison. And so those folks, again, everybody who is released aren't facing 20 years, but sometimes you are. And so I think that is, that we can show that the same risk assessment can be used for deportation hearings because the likelihood of such a bad outcome is similar, right? Deportation and 15 years in prison, you can argue which one is better than the other. And so,
Well, what's blocking it? Is it like an informal agreement between?
well, from us, right? And so it's
And where does that come from?
that's from ICE, that's federal law. Yeah.
So they have no wiggle room. You could not release
I think
people.
that's a big issue here that we need to, because, and I think the example I gave is one that could be given that, people come to court from home facing 10, 15, 20 years in prison, and they still show up, right? The argument is, as you said, if you're facing deportation, why would you ever show up at court? No. There's a lot of folks who won't get deported. There's a lot of incentive to come, but I think that there is this automatic feeling of, well, you're not going to show up if you're facing deportation, therefore you get an automatic hold. That's what we need to begin to break down, that policy.
Gary, could you again reframe what's going on in Santa Clara?
So prior to October of last year, it's exactly what David said, is we had no discretion to release anybody with a civil detainment. Since that time, we don't, again, honor any civil detainers.
Now, where is that coming from?
That came from the Board of Supervisors.
So the County Board of Supervisors have authorized you.
They gave a directive in the county, a moratorium, so to speak, and that we would, Santa Clara County would not honor any detainers until ICE began to, the financial thing, pay for the services we were rendering in the jail, bed costs.
Do the feds have any thing they can do to you by not?
No, but I guess they could, but they haven't done anything so far. But they have found ways around this. Obviously, what I'm hearing is these individuals sometimes are released with some pretrial release. They know ICE knows when their court date is, and they wait for them outside the courtroom. And we end up being a failure to appear, and the person gets a bench warrant, and because they never made a court date.
So you just treat them as a regular pretrial defendant, and you take the ICE hold out of the equation and just treat them like that.
Correct.
Any other counties doing that in California? Are you aware of?
I don't know.
San Francisco. Okay.
And there's
Question?
some places where
Sorry.
ICE is paying, right, the county for detention. And it was just on realignment, down in County, when we were waiting for the inmates who were in state prison to be released. The normal release date, contrary to a lot of police, a lot of media calling and can you tell us where the bus is going to be mass releases? But this was people's normal release date, but instead of getting out on parole, they were going to get out under probation supervision. And many of them didn't, right? We were waiting for them, and then they said, oh, well, ICE picked them up from San Quentin. ICE picked them up from us. That was an interesting, it's a good number of folks who were being, when they finished with their state prison term, being transferred.
Okay, all right. 2 questions or comments? Yes. Just announce your name, please, and... That's what I was wondering, yeah. Right. All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Ellen Rice from Panelists first. This is a question for Garry and David. It was very interesting to hear you talk about the program keeping involved with, and it sounds like the risk assessment to its effectiveness is an important factor. What other advice given your years of experience in running these kinds of programs would you have for Anna or for those or for ICE, for example, in terms of designing effective alternative detention programs, in addition to effective risk assessment tools? What other kinds of factors have you found important to consider your success?
Thank you.
The immediate one that comes to mind is a phone call reminder system. What we have in place in Santa Clara is not only a phone call the day before court, but also a letter the week before they get reminded. We're also looking to upgrade that to text and email notification. Currently, I'm working with the Public Defender's Office and finding one for the county. As you all know, we're probably all pretty high-functioning individuals, but we forget our dentist appointments, and that's why we get reminders from our dentist. So that's a real crucial piece. But I also think having trained staff and educating them, educating the judges, regular meetings with the judges, informing, keeping the criminal justice system you're involved in involved through the whole pretrial system and brought in, and using that financial savings at pretrial, publicizing that and getting that word out is a key component to effective pretrial.
It's interesting to hear Garry talk about what is required of Santa Clara and his financial decision. And, unfortunately, a lot of folks who aren't moved by things like justice and rightness and are moved by fiscal issues. California's thing with the court, obviously a court decision, but also the humongous expense of incarceration. So I think to begin to say, in Alameda County, we basically say detention costs about $78 a day, and electronic monitoring costs about $10 to $20 a day. So we begin to show, and electronic monitoring is often just as effective as far as getting someone to show up right to their court date as incarceration. And with AB 109, actually electronic monitoring counts as detention days, right? So the credit you get for electronic monitoring is the same credit you get as if you were detained. And I know that's an issue around that, ICE not seeing that as the case, and so I think there's some lessons learned in California. A few things that BI is doing, and I share the concern that The alternative to detention is now owned by one of the largest private prison
VI
providers,
is,
behavioral interventions, which has been around for a while, and they've recently, in the last year or so, bought Geo, which is a large private prison provider, and behavioral interventions VI provides detention alternatives throughout the state, in fact, throughout the country. But they have a day reporting center model. Some are run better than others, but the model itself, I think, is very effective. And so people who would otherwise, if it's one effectively, people who would otherwise be locked up waiting for their detention hearing and their adjudication process are home or at some shelter or some type of non-locked facility, and then every day show up to a day reporting center. There may be job training, there may be other services provided, which is also an incentive because often then there's jobs connected to that in Oakland and I think in San Diego. Caltrans provides jobs to the folks that go to the day reporting centers. And so there are effective programs in addition to just not only making sure you come to your hearing, but also getting some services and some enrichment out of the alternative, where electronic monitoring will provide that. It's just the monitoring ankle. Some of the day reporting or even reporting center programs can also provide training services.
All right, thank you. We got time for 2 more people. Great. Load it up now.
Jim, I think you just, you said that you were aware that Iceholes are low risk for citizens.
Right.
I'm just wondering is that based on just your knowledge of the whole system, or is it studies?
Okay. All right, thank you.
Can't see you over here. So a couple things. I think that widens the big issue. Let me give an example that's unfair. So in New York City, there's something called the Center for Organization. There's wonderful people, great people I know and love, and they run these community courts. Because of how the criminal justice system has evolved in New York, this is an unfortunate statement, I don't want to be a DFA, but pretty much the entirety of those wonderful courts are almost entirely net-lining. Almost everybody going to those courts would have otherwise, their case would have been thrown out. The low-level cases where the DA there's so many cases in New York, and for the most part, you're not going to prison in New York these days unless you're there for a pretty serious offense, and that doesn't really happen in New York with the exceptions. And so it's really interesting to go through this wonderful process where you have a judge very involved, you have a community very involved, it's a community court, and there's windows that run in Red Hook, Brooklyn, Midtown Manhattan, and Harlem. But almost the entire population of those coming to those courts wouldn't even be in court, right, if that didn't exist. And so it is this rough situation, a great program. Like you go to the Eden Reporting Center in Alameda County, and it's like, wow, this is an incredible computer lab and music studios and a health clinic and all of this stuff. But if the alternative, this young person would not have otherwise been, like, if he was going on his own, great. But now he has to come, and if he doesn't show up, you're going to lock him up. That's the problem with the whole net widening piece. And so where I've seen it effective is when it's based on a risk assessment. When you're saying, this risk assessment says to us, if it's the detention risk assessment, that Dr. Austin has done in many places, that says this young person reaches over 10 points, therefore we're going to detain them, or this young person doesn't, that only the ones who would have otherwise absolutely been detained have this option of an alternative. And the problem is the probation department or the pretrial services department may give that as the report to the judge, but then it is the judge's decision. And sometimes you can train judges in these evidence-based practices, and other times judges are saying, I've been doing this for 15 years, 20 years, don't come to me with this new jack stuff, I'm going to continue to make this decision. But so when the decisions to place in an alternative is based on a risk assessment, a sound risk assessment, that's the...
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Anna. Sure. Sorry.
And the model that we're talking about with the program that other is implementing is not using these stuff as multiple times. It is not using as a condition of release so much as additional services and access that are already being released on the road. Does that make sense? So it's not. Yeah. Right, exactly. And so that's for the risk assessment tool. I mean, we'll see, and hopefully we'll be able to get some information on data but this program specifically is not it's a volunteer program for folks coming out and doesn't access as wanted, but it's not CCN again.
And then on the risk assessment, yeah, if the example I gave this morning, CDCR has its own risk assessment, it's been validated. So when you apply that tool against the ICE inmates that are to be deported, they score disproportionately higher on low, moderate risk, largely because of the nature of the crime, their age, other stability items in their criminal record is less than so-called typical inmate. Pre-trial, you're going to see the same thing because they're going to show up, they're going to do really well on stability factors. Anyone that's hired them to do landscaping and stuff like that knows that, you know, they are hard workers, they have families to support, they're trying to stay below the radar, so they're not going out of their way to do anything that catch the attention of authorities, so that they will score, and they are extremely good risks not to fail to appear for a court hearing or to get rearrested again. And the only issue I think is out there is, will they show up for a deportation hearing? Last question.
Quick comment and question. I just wanted to share a quick piece of campaign that actually ties both the alignment and immigration detention. It's in Contra Costa County, where the sheriff was proposing a $9 million bail extension, and both those that are formerly incarcerated as well as immigrant advocates came together and we have temporarily stopped the jail expansion based on an argument that the sheriff wanted 150 beds for realignment.
Oh.
He had 150 beds that he was renting to ICE under what we call an intergovernmental service agreement for people held in immigration detention facing removal proceedings. We don't know where it's going to go now, but there's at least a temporary stop and an ability to negotiate how to deal with these ICE goods.
Right.
The question I have though is particularly for Garry, but I think people across the country are very interested in knowing, with this new policy in Santa Clara County around ICE detainers, what kind of cost savings and how is this going to reduce caseloads? Is there any information available on that at this point in time?
I honestly don't have any information on that, and I don't track individuals released to me by if they have a detainer or not. It's something we have not delved into or looked into. And quite frankly, when we did this, it was highly publicized, but we haven't even, it hasn't even come up again since it happened. So,
Yeah.
except setting some policy in for the jail staff and so forth, and so on, we don't provide any information to the government on that. So, but I don't have any specifics, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank our three panelists this morning, and we're going to take a 15-minute break for coffee, refreshments, and we'll reconvene here at about, I think, 11:10. Okay, thank you.